The morning of June 14, 1944, Saipan Island, Central Pacific. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood within the concrete walls of his command post overlooking Chiran Kanoa. Field glasses pressed to his eyes as the first light of dawn revealed American warships on the horizon, gray silhouettes gliding through the mist like ghosts of steel. 2.5 years earlier, Nagumo had led the carrier strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, he commanded the Central Pacific Area Fleet from this 5-mile-wide island, 1,500 miles from Tokyo, yet now the front line of Japan's defense. Behind him, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito examined the deployment maps spread across the table, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. 30,000 troops garrisoned Saipan. Artillery crowned the hills overlooking every approach. Machine gun nests, barbed wire entanglements, and concrete pillboxes dotted the beaches. Even the island's caves had been transformed into strongpoints, their steel doors ready to defy any assault. Nagumo lowered his binoculars. "The Americans will come tomorrow," he said softly. "They'll bypass the Carolines and strike here directly." "Intelligence confirms it," Saito nodded with calm assurance. "Let them come. Their island-hopping strategy means nothing here. This is no undefended atoll in the Gilberts or Marshalls. Saipan is fortified. We are ready. They'll bleed on these beaches until their losses force them to negotiate peace." For a brief moment, the two men shared a quiet confidence. For months, Japanese planners had watched the American advance across the Pacific with a mixture of concern and contempt. The Americans had embraced a strategy they called island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified positions to capture lightly defended ones. To Japanese eyes, it was a strategy born of timidity. They believed the Americans feared direct confrontation with well-prepared defenses. Tokyo had spent all of 1943 reinforcing the outer defensive perimeter. Massive bases such as Rabaul and Truk Lagoon had been turned into bastions. Yet the Americans simply sailed past them. Rabaul, with its 100,000 troops, was isolated, not attacked. Truk Lagoon, Japan's Pearl Harbor of the Pacific, was bypassed entirely. The pattern seemed obvious. The Americans avoided hard targets. This belief shaped Japanese planning across the Pacific. Commanders poured resources into the most obvious strategic points, trusting that the strength of their defenses would deter attack. The logic was simple. Make any objective costly enough, and the Americans would go around it. But Saipan would test that philosophy like no other. The island sat in the Mariana Chain, close enough to Japan that B-29 Super Fortress bombers could strike Tokyo from its airfields. The Americans needed Saipan. They could not bypass it. To continue their march toward Japan, they would have to storm the island's defenses head-on. To Japanese strategists, this was a perfect trap. If the Americans attacked, they would suffer catastrophic casualties. If they bypassed Saipan, they would lose strategic momentum. Either outcome, the Japanese believed, would serve the empire. High American casualties would weaken public support for the war. A delay in operations would buy Tokyo time to negotiate a favorable peace. Weeks earlier, Saito had expressed this very confidence in a message to Tokyo. "The fate of the empire will be decided in this one action," he wrote. "But rest assured, Saipan's defenses are formidable. The enemy will not take this island without losses they cannot sustain." That confidence had precedent. At Tarawa Atoll 6 months before, American Marines had lost 3,300 men in just 76 hours, seizing an island barely 2 miles long. The Japanese defenders, though outnumbered 10-1, had exacted a brutal price. The lesson seemed clear. Determined defenders in prepared positions could make any victory a Pyrrhic one. Saipan's garrison was 60 times larger than Tarawa's. The island itself was 60 times the size. Its defenses were exponentially greater. Japanese calculations concluded that the Americans would need to commit forces so vast and suffer losses so high that even victory would bleed them dry. What Nagumo and Saito failed to realize was that American strategy had evolved. Island hopping was not caution, it was efficiency. The Americans no longer sought to avoid strongholds out of fear, but to target only what mattered strategically. And Saipan mattered. The Marianas mattered. These islands would bring U.S. bombers within range of Japan's home islands and sever the lifelines of the Southern Empire. No level of fortification could deter that kind of necessity. The confidence Nagumo and Saito displayed that morning rested on a fatal misunderstanding. They believed America's strategy was shaped by fear of casualties. In truth, it was shaped by strategic necessity, and when an objective was essential, the Americans would pay whatever price victory demanded. They would not bypass Saipan, they would overwhelm it. Each battle in the Pacific served a precise strategic purpose. Resources were never wasted on targets that could be isolated and neutralized without direct assault. The Japanese High Command fundamentally misunderstood this approach. To them, the American tendency to bypass heavily fortified islands signaled weakness, a supposed unwillingness to accept casualties. Confident in this misinterpretation, Japanese commanders poured men and materials into strongholds they deemed vital, convinced that making them costly enough to attack would deter the Americans. They failed to grasp the underlying logic. The United States would strike only where strategic value justified the cost, and ignore everything else. This miscalculation echoed across the Pacific campaign. Rabaul, with over 100,000 Japanese troops, was isolated and left to wither. Truk, Japan's main naval base in the Central Pacific, was rendered useless by air attack and bypassed entirely. Dozens of massive fortifications built at immense cost never fired a shot in anger, because they controlled nothing the Americans needed. But Saipan was different. Saipan could not be bypassed. Its airfields were essential, its location critical. From here, B-29 bombers could reach Japan itself, and for that reason, the United States committed whatever forces were required to take it. The garrison fought with extraordinary courage and determination, inflicting heavy losses. Yet bravery alone could not counter overwhelming material superiority. Saipan exposed the vast asymmetry between the two nations. Japan's limited industry, shrinking resources and precarious supply lines against America's boundless factories, secure logistics and near-limitless manpower. Every Japanese loss, an aircraft, a tank, a veteran soldier, was irreplaceable. Every American loss could be replenished within weeks. Ships sunk at Pearl Harbor were raised, repaired, and returned to service. Aircraft shot down were replaced by new production runs. Men killed were replaced by trained reserves drawn from an inexhaustible pool. The imbalance was not only one of quantity, but of evolution. American doctrine adapted with every battle. Lessons learned at Tarawa refined the assault on Kwajalein. Experience at Kwajalein shaped the planning for Saipan. Each operation saw improvements in tactics, landing craft, and coordination. Naval gunfire became more precise, amphibious landings more efficient, combined arms integration more seamless. Japanese doctrine, however, remained largely static. The same defensive pattern repeated: beach resistance, fallback to rugged terrain, nighttime counterattacks, and final banzai charges when defeat was inevitable. These tactics inflicted casualties but never changed outcomes. Lacking resources and time, Japan could not evolve its strategy fast enough to matter. The human cost of Saipan extended far beyond military losses. More than 22,000 civilians perished. Some were caught in the crossfire. Others, driven by propaganda portraying Americans as monsters, took their own lives. Japanese soldiers often coerced civilians into suicide rather than allow surrender. The tragedy at Marpy Point, where hundreds leapt from cliffs to their deaths, remains one of the most haunting images of the Pacific War. For the Marines and soldiers who fought there, Saipan was a scar burned into memory. The killing grounds of Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge stayed with them forever. The sights, the stench, the exhaustion of relentless combat under tropical heat. 7 medals of honor were awarded for actions on Saipan, all posthumously. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, Private First Class Harold Agar Holm, Captain Ben Salomon, Private Thomas Baker, Lieutenant Colonel Aquila J. Dias, Private Joseph Osborne, and Lieutenant J.G. Robert Mard. Each citation told of valor beyond comprehension, each a testament to the price of victory. For the Japanese survivors, that price came in shame. Of a garrison tens of thousands strong, only 931 were captured, less than 3%. Most were too wounded to fight or die by suicide. They faced the rest of the war as prisoners, burdened by the stigma of surrender in a culture that revered death over capture. Many would carry that guilt for the rest of their lives. Strategically, Saipan's fall sent shockwaves through Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had sworn that Saipan would never fall, resigned on July 18, 1944, taking his cabinet with him. Emperor Hirohito, learning that Tokyo was now within range of B-29 bombers, began to doubt Japan's chances for the first time. Cracks appeared in the illusion of inevitable victory. For the Americans, Saipan validated Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific strategy. The long debate between Nimitz's island-hopping plan and General Douglas MacArthur's approach from the Southwest Pacific was finally resolved. Saipan proved that the Central Pacific route could yield decisive results. It also justified the immense investment in amphibious warfare, the LVTs that ferried Marines through enemy fire, the landing ships that brought tanks and artillery ashore, and the naval gunnery that shattered Japanese fortifications with pinpoint accuracy. 80 years later, Saipan remains American soil, part of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Its economy now depends on tourism. Visitors can walk the invasion beaches, where rusting Japanese tanks still rest where they fell in June 1944. Memorials honor both American and Japanese dead. At Marpy Point, the cliffs of tragedy are preserved as sacred ground. The airfield once built by Seabees for B-29s is now Saipan International Airport, its runways still serving aircraft, though few passengers know they travel across ground that helped end a world war. The story of Saipan reveals an unchanging truth about modern warfare. Strategy outweighs valor. Industry outweighs courage. Logistics outweigh tactics. The Japanese garrison fought heroically, but heroism could not defeat superior strategy, overwhelming production, and relentless execution. The fatal Japanese misjudgment, mocking island hopping as weakness, cost them the war. When the United States deemed an island essential, it committed everything necessary to take it. Casualties were accepted as the price of necessity. Resources were mobilized on a scale Japan could not imagine, and once committed, America never turned back. On June 14, 1944, Admiral Nagumo and General Saito stood in their command post, certain their defenses would bleed the invaders dry. They believed spirit could triumph over steel. They believed the Americans would retreat once losses mounted. Every belief proved false. Every assumption was shattered. 25 days later, both men were dead. The island they vowed to defend was in American hands. From its airfields, B-29 superfortresses were already preparing to carry the war to Japan's doorstep. The lesson was undeniable. The age of warfare decided by courage had ended. The age of industrial war, where production and logistics determine victory, had begun. Saipan was not the largest or bloodiest battle of the Pacific, but it was among the most decisive. Its capture enabled the bombing campaign that brought Japan to its knees and triggered the political collapse that would lead to surrender. When the Marines waded ashore on June 15, 1944, they were not merely taking another island, they were executing the strategy that would win the Pacific War. The cost was immense, the fighting brutal. But once America committed, the outcome was inevitable. Not because its soldiers were braver, but because its vision, industry, and logistics made defeat impossible. That was the truth Admiral Nagumo and General Saito learned too late. That was the lesson Saipan taught. The world island hopping was not weakness. It was strategic, mastery. And when the strategy demanded a price, America paid it in full.